November 30th, 1942, 23:11 hours. The waters off Guadalcanal. The moon hangs absent from the sky, swallowed by clouds that move like funeral shrouds across the Southern Cross. The sea is black, not the blue-black of deep ocean under starlight, but the absolute black of ink, of coal, of the void between stars. 5 American cruisers steam in column through Iron Bottom Sound, their bows cutting phosphorescent wakes that glow like ghost fire in the darkness. The water temperature is 82 degrees, warm as blood, but the men on deck feel cold, their hands gripping binoculars and speaking tubes with the particular tension that comes when every shadow might conceal death. Aboard the heavy cruiser Minneapolis, radar operators study green screens where electronic blips shimmer and fade, trying to separate metal from wave return, trying to distinguish between the islands that crowd this narrow strait and the ships that might be approaching through darkness their eyes cannot penetrate. The technology is new. Mark III surface search radar installed just months ago, still mysterious in its capabilities and limitations, still treated with the skepticism that old sailors reserve for machines that claim to see through night and weather. The operators call out contacts, ranges, bearings, their voices steady despite the knowledge that their interpretation might mean the difference between ambush and survival. Task Force 67, under the command of Rear Admiral Carlton Wright, has been sent to intercept what intelligence reports describe as a Tokyo Express run, Japanese destroyers attempting to deliver supplies to their starving garrison on Guadalcanal. For 4 months, the island has been a fulcrum upon which the Pacific War balances, contested yard by yard in jungle and airfield, and in these waters where ships hunt each other through darkness. The Americans hold Henderson Field, the airstrip that makes Guadalcanal valuable, but the Japanese refuse to concede, sending ships down the slot, the passage through the Solomon Islands, under cover of night to resupply their troops and evacuate their wounded, to fight for control of an island that both sides now recognize as symbolic, as the place where the Japanese advance must be stopped, or where the American counteroffensive will die. The American sailors do not know that they are steaming into a battle that will become a case study in naval warfare. A textbook example of how technology without training, of how radar without doctrine, of how numerical superiority without tactical wisdom can transform victory into catastrophe. They know only that somewhere ahead in the darkness, Japanese ships are moving, and that their orders are to intercept and destroy. They have faith in their cruisers, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Northampton, Honolulu, ships whose names evoke American cities, American power, the industrial might of a nation that can build such vessels by the dozen. They have faith in their radar, in their guns, in their admiral who is new to these waters, but who carries the confidence of a service that has begun to believe, after Midway, after the battles around Guadalcanal, that the Japanese can be beaten. What they do not know, what their radar cannot tell them, what their intelligence has not revealed, is that 8 Japanese destroyers are not fleeing but waiting, their crews trained to a degree of precision that American observers will later struggle to credit, armed with a weapon that will prove on this night to be the most devastating torpedo in any Navy's arsenal. The Type 93 torpedo, called Long Lance by Americans who will eventually capture one and study it with the horrified fascination of men examining a predator's teeth, is oxygen-fueled rather than compressed air, leaving no wake, running at 48 knots for 22 miles, or at 38 knots for nearly 30 miles, carrying a 1,000-pound warhead. By comparison, American torpedoes are slower, shorter-ranged, prone to running deep or failing to detonate, flawed weapons that have cost submarines and surface ships countless opportunities, that have become a bitter joke among the men who must rely on them. The Japanese destroyers carry these long lances in batteries, 24 tubes per ship in some cases, reloadable, aimed by doctrine and training that emphasizes night combat. that has prepared these crews for exactly this scenario through thousands of hours of drill. The Japanese Navy has studied night fighting with the obsession of men who know they cannot match American industrial production, who must win through skill and surprise and the willingness to embrace tactics that seem suicidal to Western eyes. The destroyers are commanded by Captain Torajiro Sato, embarked in the destroyer Naganami, a veteran of these waters who has run the Tokyo Express dozens of times, who knows every island and current, who has learned to navigate by instinct when instruments fail, and to trust his torpedomen to hit targets they cannot see. At 23:16 hours, the American destroyers screening ahead of the cruiser column detect the Japanese force on radar. Multiple contacts, bearing 310 degrees, range approximately 7 miles. Admiral Wright, receiving the report on Minneapolis, faces a decision that will be analyzed and debated for decades. His destroyers, 4 Fletcher-class ships under Commander William Cole, are in position to launch torpedoes immediately to strike the Japanese formation before it can react. Commander Cole requests permission to fire, but Wright, new to these waters, uncertain of the radar picture, concerned about firing on what might be friendly vessels or on the coastline of Guadalcanal itself, hesitates. He waits, he studies the plot, he considers the variables. The seconds stretch into minutes. This hesitation is not cowardice. Wright is a career officer, a man of proven courage. It is the hesitation of someone operating with incomplete information, with technology he does not fully trust, with the burden of command in waters that have already claimed too many American ships. Iron Bottom Sound has earned its name. Quincy, Vincennes, Astoria, Atlanta, Juneau, and others rest on the bottom, their crews entombed or scattered, their loss a testament to Japanese skill in night combat. Wright does not want to add to that tally through friendly fire or through premature action that might reveal his position to an enemy he has not yet fixed. But while Wright deliberates, the Japanese are not waiting. At 23:20 hours, Sato's destroyers execute a maneuver practiced until it has become instinctive. They launch torpedoes, 44 long lances in the first salvo, ripple-fired from tubes that have been pre-aimed, based on estimated target course and speed. The torpedoes enter the water with minimal splash, their oxygen engines leaving no telltale bubbles, and begin their run toward the American column at depths calculated to strike cruiser hulls below the waterline. The Japanese do not wait to observe results. They turn away, accelerating, preparing to reload or to withdraw depending on how the battle develops. The entire action, detection, calculation, firing, turn, has taken less than 3 minutes, executed with a precision that reflects doctrine refined through years of preparation. The American radar operators see the Japanese ships turn, see them begin to withdraw, and interpret this as retreat. Admiral Wright, watching the plot, concludes that he has surprised the enemy, that the Japanese are fleeing. At 23:21 hours, 1 minute after the Japanese torpedo launch, he gives permission for his destroyers to fire their torpedoes, and he orders his cruisers to open fire with their main batteries. The cruisers swing to unmask their guns, their fire control radars locking onto the Japanese ships now 7 miles distant. And at 23:24 hours, the first salvos thunder into the night. The cruisers Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Northampton, and Honolulu each mount 9 or 10 8-inch guns, weapons capable of hurling 260-pound armor-piercing shells 20 miles with accuracy that radar fire control has made deadly even in darkness. The night erupts in orange flame as the cruisers fire in sequence, their muzzle flashes illuminating their own superstructures in stark white light, their shells screaming across the water in flat trajectories. To the crews, it seems that they have caught the enemy by surprise, that American technology and firepower are asserting dominance. Spotters report hits, flashes on the horizon that might be shells striking home or might be Japanese ships returning fire. The action is confusing, the information fragmentary. But the overall impression is of a successful engagement, of an enemy driven off or destroyed. And then, at 23:27 hours, the torpedoes arrive. The first long lance strikes Minneapolis on her starboard bow, the explosion tearing away 60 feet of the forward hull, the blast traveling through steel and void and crew spaces with a violence that defies description. Men in the forward compartments, sleeping in bunks, standing watch, reading letters from home, cease to exist. Vaporized or drowned in the fraction of a second it takes for the ocean to claim space where steel had been. The cruiser's bow, thousands of tons of metal and machinery, simply disappears, and the sea rushes in with the weight of an avalanche. Minneapolis slews to starboard, her rudder useless, her forward momentum carrying her in a circle, while her crew scrambles to seal bulkheads, to contain the flooding, to keep the ship from joining the wrecks already littering the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. Seconds later, New Orleans takes a torpedo on her port bow. The detonation is catastrophic. The forward magazine ignites, adding the explosive force of hundreds of shells to the torpedo's warhead and the entire bow of the ship. From the forward turret to the anchor chains, detaches 125 feet of cruiser, weighing thousands of tons, sinks immediately, and the truncated hull plows through its own severed bow section, the jagged steel edge of the wound cutting through wreckage and bodies, the ship's momentum carrying her forward in a grotesque parody of normal navigation. Below decks, watertight doors slam shut on men who have no time to escape, sealing them in flooding compartments where they will drown in darkness, where their screams will echo unheard over the roar of inrushing water. Pensacola is next. A torpedo strikes amidships, punching through the hull below the waterline. The explosion, rupturing fuel tanks and igniting aviation gasoline stored for the ship's float planes. Fire erupts from the wound, orange and white and hot enough to melt aluminum, hot enough to turn men into torches, hot enough to cook off ammunition in ready lockers around the aft turret. The cruiser begins to list, her crew fighting fires and flooding simultaneously. Damage control parties running through passageways filled with smoke, dragging hoses, carrying wounded, trying to save their ship even as she threatens to capsize. Northampton, steaming fourth in line, takes a torpedo on her portside aft. The explosion destroys the cruiser's engineering spaces, killing everyone in them, men who have no warning, who are at their stations monitoring boilers and turbines when the torpedo transforms their workspace into a furnace. The ship loses power, loses propulsion, begins to settle by the stern as flooding progresses through ruptured bulkheads. Her captain orders the crew to abandon ship, but many men refuse, staying at pumps and hoses, trying to save her, working until the water rises to their waists, their chests, until the ship rolls over and takes them with her. Northampton will sink at 03:04 hours on December 1st, the only cruiser of the 5 to be lost completely, her hull resting now in 2,000 feet of water. A tomb for 58 officers and men, only Honolulu, steaming last in line, escapes unscathed, protected by position, by luck, by the simple mathematics of torpedo spread patterns that left her outside the killing zone. She continues firing at the Japanese ships, now withdrawing at high speed, but her shells fall into empty water. The enemy having broken contact, having accomplished what they came to do. The battle lasts 11 minutes from first shot to last. When the guns fall silent, 4 American heavy cruisers are crippled, 1 is sinking, and hundreds of men are dead or wounded. The Japanese have lost 1 destroyer, Takanami, hit by American gunfire and left dead in the water, later scuttled by her own torpedoes, and suffered fewer than 40 casualties. The supply mission that the Americans had been sent to intercept is only partially disrupted. The remaining Japanese destroyers jettison their cargo drums into the sea off Guadalcanal as planned, leaving them to be swept ashore by current and tide, where Japanese soldiers will retrieve them, finding food and ammunition wrapped in waterproof containers. finding hope delivered by comrades who fought through an American ambush and emerged victorious. This disparity, 4 cruisers crippled in exchange for 1 destroyer, will haunt American naval officers for months. The battle will be analyzed in classrooms at the Naval War College, dissected in after-action reports, argued over in wardrooms across the Pacific Fleet. How did this happen? How did an American force with numerical superiority, with radar, with firepower advantage, suffer such a one-sided defeat? The answers are uncomfortable, cutting at assumptions about technological supremacy and American fighting ability. Admiral Wright will be criticized, gently but unmistakably, for his hesitation in allowing his destroyers to fire torpedoes when they had the advantage. But the criticism is unfair, or at least incomplete. Wright's hesitation was born of caution instilled by previous disasters, by the knowledge that Iron Bottom's Sound had claimed too many ships, by the fear of repeating the mistakes of Savo Island, where American cruisers had been surprised and slaughtered in a night action that lasted barely half an hour. Wright's error was not lack of courage, but lack of understanding. He did not yet know that in night combat against the Japanese, hesitation was fatal, that the enemy would not wait politely for Americans to sort out their radar plots and their rules of engagement. The American destroyers, too, will be faulted. Their torpedoes, Mark 15 weapons that were obsolete before the war began, ran too slow, too shallow, or failed to detonate. Of 20 torpedoes fired by the American destroyers, none hit their targets. This is not the fault of the men who launched them, who aimed and calculated correctly, but of a procurement and testing system that had failed for 20 years to produce a reliable weapon. The Mark 15 and its submarine equivalent, the Mark 14, were plagued by magnetic detonators that fired prematurely or not at all, by depth-keeping mechanisms that ran 10 feet deeper than set, by contact detonators so poorly designed that they would crumple on impact with a target's hull without triggering the warhead. These defects were known submariners, had been complaining for a year, but institutional. Inertia and the refusal of the Bureau of Ordnance to admit error meant that American torpedoes would remain defective for another 18 months, costing lives and opportunities that can never be calculated. But the Japanese torpedoes worked. The Long Lance was not just functional, it was exceptional. A weapon so superior to its American counterpart that captured examples would be studied with disbelief by engineers who could not understand how Japanese industry, assumed to be backward, assumed to produce inferior copies of Western technology, had created something so advanced. The answer lay in different priorities. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested in torpedo development with the same fervor that the U.S. Navy had invested in carrier aviation, and the result was a weapon that gave Japanese destroyers lethality out of proportion to their size. More than the weapon, though, was the doctrine. Japanese destroyer crews trained constantly in night torpedo attacks, practicing in all weather and sea conditions until the sequence of actions, detect, calculate, launch, withdraw, became reflexive. They used stopwatches to time their maneuvers. They memorized tables of torpedo running time versus target distance. They drilled until they could load and aim and fire in darkness, under pressure, with a speed and accuracy that American observers would describe as uncanny. This was not luck. This was preparation meeting opportunity. Skill, honed through years of peacetime practice, now applied to wartime necessity. The American sailors, by contrast, were brave but unprepared for this kind of combat. The U.S. Navy had spent the interwar years focused on daylight actions between battle lines, on the theory that future wars would be decided by battleship duels fought at long range, with aircraft spotting for the guns. Night combat was considered a specialized skill, secondary to the main effort, and training time was limited. Radar was supposed to compensate, to give American ships the ability to see in darkness. But radar in 1942 was primitive, prone to false contacts, unable to distinguish between ships and islands with the clarity needed for split-second decisions. The operators were young, hastily trained, still learning the difference between wave clutter and submarine periscopes, between rain squalls and incoming air attacks. And so, at Tassafaronga, technology without training met training without technology, and training won. The Japanese, operating with less sophisticated equipment but with superior doctrine and preparation, achieved a tactical victory so lopsided that it would force American naval leadership to reconsider fundamental assumptions. Within weeks, night combat training would be intensified throughout the fleet. Tactics would be revised, emphasizing earlier torpedo launches, more aggressive maneuvering, better coordination between destroyers and cruisers. Radar operators would receive more extensive training, learning to interpret their screens with greater confidence. And slowly, painfully, the institutional resistance to admitting that American torpedoes were defective would erode, leading eventually to the fixes that would make the Mark 14 and Mark 15 reliable weapons. But these changes came too late for the men in the water off Guadalcanal on the morning of December 1st, 1942. Hundreds floated in oil-slicked seas, clinging to debris, calling for rescuers, waiting through the long hours until dawn, when American ships could return without risking further attack. Many died in the water, from wounds, from exhaustion, from sharks drawn by blood. Destroyers eventually recovered more than 1,000 survivors, men burned and broken, men who had been inside steel ships that had seemed invincible, and who now knew that steel could be torn like paper, that American technology was not a talisman against death, the symbolic object that recurs through accounts of Tassafaronga is not food or flags, but light, the light of muzzle flashes revealing American ships to an enemy that fought from darkness, the light of fire consuming fuel and ammunition, the light of searchlights playing across water looking for survivors, the light of dawn revealing the scope of disaster. Light in this battle was betrayal. The Americans illuminated themselves with their gunfire, marking their positions for an enemy who needed no light to aim, who had trained to fight in darkness and who turned that darkness into a weapon. The Japanese, by contrast, operated in shadow, launching their torpedoes unseen, withdrawing before the Americans could effectively respond, using the night as both shield and sword. This reversal, the Japanese exploiting darkness while the Americans relied on light and technology, mirrors the larger narrative of the Guadalcanal campaign. The United States entered the war confident in its material superiority, certain that industrial capacity would translate directly to military success. But in the jungles of Guadalcanal and in the waters surrounding it, Americans learned that war is not simply a matter of resources, but of their application. That the side with fewer ships and planes and men could win through superior training, superior tactics, superior understanding of the terrain and conditions. The Japanese soldiers defending Guadalcanal were starving, their supply lines interdicted, their reinforcements decimated by air attacks during daylight hours. But at night, in these waters, Japanese destroyers still ruled, still successfully ran the Tokyo Express, still delivered enough supplies to keep the garrison fighting. Tassafaronga was the last major naval victory the Japanese would achieve around Guadalcanal, but it came at a strategic moment when American morale needed the opposite. The island campaign was reaching its climax. American forces had been reinforced, Henderson Field was operational and expanding, and the Japanese High Command was beginning to consider withdrawal, to recognize that Guadalcanal could not be held at acceptable cost. But Japanese soldiers on the island did not know this yet, and the supplies delivered during the November 30th Tokyo Express run, the run that Tassafaronga had been meant to intercept, bought a few more days. A few more weeks kept the garrison viable through December and into January. The cost of this tactical victory, measured in Japanese terms, was minimal. One destroyer lost, a handful of men killed, some supplies jettisoned into the sea rather than landed at the beach. The cost, in American terms, was enormous. 4 heavy cruisers that would require months of repair. One cruiser sunk, more than 700 men killed or wounded, and a blow to confidence that statistics alone cannot measure. The myth of American invincibility, already dented by the early disasters of 1942, Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, took another hit. The belief that technology could substitute for training, that radar and firepower could compensate for tactical skill, was revealed as hollow. Admiral Wright would never command a surface action again. This was not punishment in the formal sense. He would continue to serve, would hold other positions, would retire with honor. But the Navy's leadership drew conclusions from Tassafaronga, and one conclusion was that commanders needed experience in these waters, needed to have absorbed the lessons that only combat could teach. Wright's replacement would be Rear Admiral Walden Ainsworth, a veteran of previous Guadalcanal battles, a man who had learned through trial and error how to fight at night against an enemy who excelled in such conditions. The cruisers, meanwhile, were salvaged with the kind of stubborn determination that characterized the American effort in the Pacific. Minneapolis was towed to Tulagi, where Seabees, naval construction battalions, built a temporary bow from coconut logs and steel plate, a makeshift repair that would allow her to steam slowly to a proper shipyard. The sight of this jury-rigged bow, lashed together with cables and covered in canvas, became a symbol of American resourcefulness, of the refusal to abandon damaged ships, of the vast logistical network that could support repairs even in forward areas thousands of miles from the nearest major port. Minneapolis would eventually reach Pearl Harbor, then continue to Bremerton, Washington, where she would receive a new bow and return to service in 1943. Her crew proud of having saved their ship against odds that might have justified abandonment. New Orleans suffered worse damage, her entire bow gone. 125 feet of ship missing, but she too was saved. Towed to Australia, where Australian and American workers fabricated a new bow section, welding it to the truncated hull in a feat of engineering that required precision measurement and skilled labor working around the clock. The cruiser would be out of action for a year, but she would return, and her survival became another data point in the calculus of industrial war. The United States could afford to repair ships that other navies would have scrapped, could devote resources to salvage that seemed profligate, but that maintained fleet strength and crew experience. Pensacola, least damaged of the 3 survivors, was back in action within weeks. Her fires extinguished, her hull patched, her crew augmented with replacements for the men lost in the Torpedo explosion. She would go on to fight in subsequent campaigns, her participation in Tassafaronga becoming a battle star on her record, a badge earned through survival rather than victory. The Japanese, for their part, celebrated Tassafaronga as a triumph, proof that Japanese spirit and training could overcome American material advantage. Japanese newspapers reported the battle in terms that emphasized skill and courage, the successful delivery of supplies to beleaguered troops, the sinking of multiple American cruisers. These reports were not fabrications. They were, by the standards of naval combat, accurate, but they omitted context. They did not mention that the Tokyo Express was a temporary expedient, a tactic born of desperation because Japanese ships could no longer safely operate in these waters during daylight. They did not mention that each destroyer used for supply runs was a destroyer not available for fleet operations, that the Imperial Japanese Navy was slowly being ground down by attrition, that victories like Tassafaronga were tactical successes within a deteriorating strategic situation. Captain Sato, the Japanese destroyer commander, was decorated and promoted. His success at Tassafaronga held up as an example to other officers. He would continue to run the Tokyo Express through December and into January 1943. Each run a calculated risk, each successful delivery prolonging the Guadalcanal garrison's resistance. But by February the decision was made. Guadalcanal would be evacuated. The Imperial Japanese Navy would execute one final operation in these waters. Not a supply run, but an evacuation. Destroyers racing in to extract the surviving soldiers under cover of darkness. A complex maneuver that would require the same skill Sato had demonstrated at Tassafaronga. The evacuation would succeed. More than 10,000 Japanese soldiers would be pulled off Guadalcanal in early February 1943, rescued from starvation and American encirclement, living to fight in later campaigns. But the island itself would fall permanently into American hands. Henderson Field would become a major base, and the strategic balance in the South Pacific would shift irreversibly. Tassafaronga, for all its tactical brilliance, had delayed this outcome by weeks, perhaps, no more. The supplies delivered had fed men who would eventually retreat. The American cruisers sunk or damaged had been replaced or repaired. In the arithmetic of total war, the battle was a footnote, significant tactically but strategically irrelevant. Yet for the men who fought there, Tassafaronga was anything but a footnote. It was the night when their ship was torn open, when their friends died in explosions or drowned in flooded compartments, when they learned that courage and technology were not sufficient, that the enemy was skilled and dangerous, that death came from darkness in the form of weapons they had not expected and could not see. This knowledge would shape their understanding of the war, would inform their actions in subsequent battles, would follow them home when the war ended and they tried to resume civilian lives. A damage control officer aboard Minneapolis, writing to his family months later, described the moment of the torpedo hit. There was no warning. One moment I was standing in the passageway, and the next I was on the deck with water rising around me. The lights went out immediately, and in the darkness I could hear men screaming, metal tearing, the roar of the ocean coming in. I knew we were sinking, knew that I had perhaps seconds to live, and the only thought in my head was that I had not said goodbye to my wife that morning before we left port. That thought, so trivial, so personal, was what I focused on while I crawled toward the ladder, while I climbed through water up to my chest, while I emerged onto the deck and saw that our bow was simply gone, that the ship was still moving forward like a blunt spear into the darkness. We did not sink by grace or luck or the skill of the damage control parties who sealed the bulkheads. But in that moment I had made peace with death, had accepted it, and coming back from that acceptance has been harder than I expected. This testimony, unpolished, emotional, deeply personal, captures what battle statistics cannot: the individual experience of combat, the moment when abstract concepts like duty and honor and sacrifice become concrete in the form of cold water and darkness and the knowledge that death is imminent. The officer survived. Hundreds of his shipmates did not, and the line between survival and death was determined by factors too small to measure: where a man was standing when the torpedo hit, whether he was on the side of a watertight door that closed or the side that flooded, whether he could swim or whether the wound he carried made swimming impossible. The Battle of Tassafaronga would be studied in naval academies for decades, analyzed for the lessons it offered about tactics, technology, training. Students would examine the radar plots, the torpedo spreads, the timing of Wright's decisions. They would debate what should have been done differently, whether the outcome could have been changed by bolder action or better coordination. These debates are useful. They inform doctrine. They prepare future officers for the decisions they will face. But they occur in classrooms, far from the water and the darkness, conducted by people who have the luxury of hindsight. The men who fought at Tassafaronga had no such luxury. They made decisions in real time, with incomplete information, under stress that few classroom scenarios can replicate. Some decisions were correct, some were errors, all were human, and the battle's outcome, tragic for the Americans, triumphant for the Japanese, was the result of choices made in fractions of seconds. Choices that seemed reasonable at the moment, but that proved, in retrospect, to have been wrong. This is the nature of war, that it punishes error with a finality that no other human endeavor matches. that it rewards skill and preparation, but also recognizes luck and chance, that it transforms young men into veterans or corpses with brutal efficiency. Tassafaronga was a school, and the tuition was paid in blood. The lessons learned there, about night combat, about torpedo tactics, about the limits of technology and the importance of training, would be applied in subsequent battles, would shape American naval doctrine for the remainder of the war. But the men who paid that tuition, who died in the explosions or drowned in the darkness, did not benefit from the lessons their deaths taught. They are the hidden cost of learning, the price of institutional education, the sacrifice upon which improvement is built. There is no glory in this, no redemptive narrative that transforms tragedy into triumph. There is only the fact of their deaths, recorded in casualty lists and marked by headstones in cemeteries across America or by names on memorials to the missing. They were sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, men with plans and dreams that ended in Iron Bottom Sound on a night when torpedoes came out of darkness and steel proved insufficient armor against Japanese skill. The Japanese sailors who sank them were not monsters. They were professionals executing a mission with the tools and training their nation had provided, fighting for a cause they believed just, defending territory they had conquered and that America was now contesting, that their cause was aligned with militarism and imperialism, that Japan's war was one of aggression and atrocity, does not diminish the individual skill and courage of men like Captain Sato and his destroyer crews. They fought well, they won. And they too paid a price, though less severe on this night, the knowledge that their victory was temporary, that the strategic situation was deteriorating, that each successful Tokyo Express run was a delay rather than a solution. Decades later, veterans of both sides would meet at reunions, old men sharing memories of a battle that had defined their youth. They would discover, as veterans often do, that they had more in common with each other than with civilians who had not experienced combat. They had shared the sea, the darkness, the terror and exhilaration of battle. They had aimed weapons at each other, had tried to kill each other, and now they could shake hands and compare notes and acknowledge the humanity they had been trained to deny. These reconciliations are possible because time erodes certainty, because age brings perspective, because men who have faced death together, even as enemies, share a bond that transcends nationality and ideology. But in November 1942, such reconciliation was unimaginable. The war was total, the stakes existential. The waters off Guadalcanal were contested not just for the island itself, but for what it represented, the limit of Japanese expansion, the beginning of American counteroffensive, the turning point where the tide of war would shift. Tassafaronga was one battle in a campaign that included dozens of engagements, but each battle mattered, each loss was felt, each victory was celebrated. The symbolic light, the muzzle flashes that marked American ships for Japanese torpedoes, represents a larger truth about the war in the Pacific. American forces entered with confidence in their technology, in their material abundance, in their ability to project power through industrial might. This confidence was not misplaced. American industry would indeed prove decisive, producing ships and planes and tanks in quantities that Axis powers could not match. But technology alone was not enough. It had to be paired with doctrine, with training, with the tactical sophistication that only experience could provide. In the early battles, Pearl Harbor, Savo Island, Tassafaronga, American forces paid the price for entering war unprepared, for assuming that material superiority would translate automatically into battlefield success. The light, in this context, is revelation, the harsh illumination of error, the exposure of weaknesses, the painful process of learning under fire. Every muzzle flash that betrayed an American cruiser's position was a lesson written in light and steel. Every torpedo that struck home was feedback from an enemy who had studied the art of war more carefully than Americans had anticipated. And every ship that survived, every crew that salvaged their vessel and returned to service, represented the capacity to learn, to adapt, to improve. This capacity would prove decisive. By 1943, American naval forces would dominate the waters around Guadalcanal. By 1944, they would conduct operations across the entire Pacific, from the Aleutians to the Philippines, from the Marianas to New Guinea. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy would be largely destroyed, its carriers sunk, its battleships at the bottom of the ocean, its destroyers expended in futile defensive actions. The trajectory from Tassafaronga to Tokyo Bay is a trajectory of learning, of institutional adaptation, of a military that could absorb losses and improve, that could honor its dead by ensuring their sacrifices contributed to eventual victory. But standing in the darkness on November 30th, 1942, watching Minneapolis plow forward with her bow missing, watching New Orleans trying to control flooding, watching Northampton settle by the stern, the men of Task Force 67 could not see this trajectory. They could see only disaster, immediate, visceral, undeniable. They could taste defeat in the oil that fouled the water, could feel it in the vibration of damaged ships struggling to stay afloat, could hear it in the screams of wounded men and the prayers of corpsmen working by flashlight to save lives. And yet, they did not quit. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Tassafaronga, the truth that survives when tactical analyses are forgotten, that men under fire, men who have every reason to despair, who have seen their ships broken and their friends killed, nonetheless continue to fight. They man the pumps, they seal the bulkheads, they rescue the wounded, they keep their ships afloat through sheer determination, through the refusal to accept that their ship, their home, their community of brothers will sink. This is not glory, it is grimmer than that, more fundamental. It is the human capacity for endurance, for collective effort in the face of catastrophe, for hope that persists even when reason suggests surrender. The American sailors at Tassafaronga were defeated tactically, but not broken spiritually. They saved 3 of 4 damaged cruisers. They recovered their dead and cared for their wounded. They filed their reports and absorbed their lessons and prepared for the next battle. Within weeks, American ships were back in Iron Bottom Sound, interdicting Japanese supply runs, supporting marine operations ashore, contesting every inch of sea with a persistence that gradually wore down the enemy. The Tokyo Express would run less frequently, would face increasing opposition, would eventually cease altogether as the strategic situation shifted. The Japanese withdrawal from Guadalcanal in February 1943 marked the end of one phase of the war and the beginning of another. The Imperial Japanese Navy had fought with skill and courage, had won tactical victories like Tassafaronga, but had lost the strategic contest. The island was in American hands. Henderson Field was secure. The line of Japanese advance had been not merely stopped, but reversed, and the long, bloody march across the Pacific toward Tokyo had begun. Tassafaronga stands as a reminder that this march was neither smooth nor inevitable. It was contested at every step by an enemy who refused to concede easily, who fought with a combination of skill and desperation that cost American forces dearly. The battle was a defeat, but it was a defeat that produced learning, that forced changes in doctrine and tactics, that ultimately contributed to later victories. This is cold comfort to the families of the men who died there, to the widows and orphans and parents who received telegrams regretfully informing them of loss. But it is the only comfort that history can offer, that their sacrifice was not meaningless, that it served a purpose within the larger narrative of the war, that it contributed to the eventual defeat of an enemy whose vision of Asia was built on conquest and subjugation. The waters off Guadalcanal are quiet now. The ships rest on the bottom, their hulls slowly corroding in salt water, their crews long since reduced to bone and memory. Divers occasionally visit these wrecks, photographing the remains, retrieving artifacts, documenting the physical evidence of battles fought 8 decades ago. They report that the ships are recognizable still, turrets and superstructures and hulls, though festooned with coral and inhabited by fish, though penetrated by holes that tell stories of violence. Northampton lies in deep water, her stern twisted, her secrets kept by darkness and depth. The other cruisers, repaired, returned to service, surviving the war, were eventually scrapped, cut apart for their steel, their metal recycled into civilian goods, their history preserved only in photographs and official records, and the memories of men who served aboard them. But memory fades. The veterans of Tassafaronga are gone now, or nearly so, men in their 90s and hundreds, if any remain, the last witnesses to a night of darkness and torpedo wakes and fire on the water. Soon there will be no one left who can describe what it felt like, how the deck tilted when the torpedo struck, what the screams sounded like in flooded compartments, how the dawn revealed the scope of disaster. Soon, Tassafaronga will be entirely history, removed from living memory, existing only in archives and academic studies and documentaries that try, imperfectly, to convey what happened and why it mattered. This is the fate of all battles eventually, to become abstract, to be reduced to statistics and maps, to lose the human dimension that made them real. But the abstraction is incomplete. Behind the statistics are individuals, the radar operator who called out the contact, the torpedo officer who requested permission to fire, the admiral who hesitated, the Japanese destroyer commander who did not. Behind the maps are moments, the instant when the torpedo struck, the decision to stay at the pumps or abandon ship, the choice to rescue a wounded friend or save oneself. Behind the strategic analyses are lives, lived fully or cut short, shaped by trauma or by survival, carrying forward the knowledge of what humans can do to each other when nations decide that war is the answer to their disputes. Tassafaronga teaches, finally, that war is always more complex than its narratives, that victory and defeat are often mixed, that the line between success and failure can be as thin as a radar operator's interpretation or as wide as the gap between Japanese and American torpedo technology. It teaches that courage is necessary but not sufficient, that good men can make bad decisions, that tragedy is often the result not of villainy, but of error compounded by circumstance. And it teaches that learning from such tragedies, extracting lessons, changing doctrine, improving training, is the duty owed to those who paid for the education with their lives. November 30th, 1942. The moon remains hidden behind clouds. The sea is black. 5 American cruisers steam in column through Iron Bottom Sound, their crews tense, their radar searching the darkness. Somewhere ahead, Japanese destroyers wait with torpedoes aimed and fuses set. In minutes, the night will erupt in fire and violence, and men will die learning lessons that should have been learned in peacetime, but were not. Because peacetime does not provide the urgency that war imposes. Because errors in peacetime result in criticism, while errors in war result in death. The torpedoes are already in the water, running silent, running true, closing the distance between launch point and target with mechanical inevitability. The American crews do not know this yet. They believe they have surprised the enemy, believe their radar and their guns will carry the day. This belief will last approximately 3 more minutes, and then it will die along with hundreds of men, and in its place will come knowledge, hard, bitter, purchased at a price that should not have been necessary, but was. Because war is the most expensive teacher humanity has ever employed, and the tuition is always paid in blood.